Pleasure to meet you and to meet some of the other people here at Alpha Delta. Let me tell you a little bit about the background of this talk and then give you my thoughts. A couple of, about a year and a half ago, when the Democrats were still in control of Congress, or in control of the House of Representatives, of course they still control the Senate, there was a meeting in Northern California, and a congressman named Pete Stark, a genuinely arrogant and malevolent fellow, very close to Nancy Pelosi, was at a town meeting, something he does not like particularly to do since it involves meeting with the ordinary people. And one of them was asking him a question about the health care law. And of course he was prepared to defend the health care law. He was very much in favor of it. But this question at the time was novel to him. He had not thought about it clearly, and in fact was surprised anyone would even ask it. And this person stood up and had the temerity to ask an esteemed member of Congress, what's the constitutional authority to pass a law on health care and that would require individuals to buy something, not as a consequence of some permission they were asking to do. In other words, you go and get a driver's license, you're asking permission to get that license, and so of course we can say, well, you have to be able to see, we won't give it to you if you're legally blind, and you have to be able to show that you can drive a car, and you have to be able to show that you can pay for any damage you might cause to other people in this, so we want insurance. Okay, but this is not that. This is just you get up in the morning and you're going to be asked to buy insurance. There's a reason that they need to do that. If they don't do that, young, healthy people will disproportionately not get insurance. And so they need that financially to make the system work. But the question is, what's the legal right that they have to do it? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but this is a very big and important question. I'm going to come back to it in a second. And Pete Stark had never, you could just see it. You know, it's like when you go into an exam and get a question, it's completely, you had never thought about that, right? And I started to see the older people in the group laughing ruefully at that, and the younger ones saying, you know, that could happen to me tomorrow. But the fact is, Pete Stark had never thought about it. And he thought about it for a minute, and you know, his first option you could see was to call the person who had asked it just a jerk, sit down, you know, that would be his preferred thing, but he decided not to do that. He did that later. He finally came up with an answer, which is essentially, we're the Congress, we can do anything we want. And they said, well, where's that? And it said, there's something called a general welfare clause. And it just says that, you know, the Congress can promote the general welfare, and it's never been considered a constitutional permission to do anything, but it was just, you know, there, and that's what he finally came up with. But it's clear, you know, he didn't know anything about the Constitution. It's clear that they had never thought about it, okay? And in fact, you may remember in the health care law, the one thing that President Obama was very clear on was that this was not a tax you're being asked. And why was it not a tax? Because you'll remember, he promised he would never raise taxes on anybody under $250,000. So, and since you could be forced to buy this, and since you don't make $250,000, then he didn't want to call it a tax. How are they defending it in court? They're defending it in court exclusively by calling it a tax. And so their constitutional defense is that they have the permission to do this because it's the taxing authority. But in the legislation it says it's not a tax, and it doesn't seem to be a tax, and you know, it doesn't look like a tax, and so forth. So there's a debate. But this Pete Stark thing and the blowback and so forth that he got from it got me to thinking about what's going on in the current political environment. And I thought that that was signaling something big and important. And I want to try to give you a sense of what that big and important thing is and how it fits into what I'm calling the fourth great debate. I'm saying that there have been four great political debates over the past century. And I'm going to give you very briefly a sense of the first three to show you that I think the one we're in now is a big deal. There are a lot of presidential campaigns which have big consequences. I mean, it matters to you whether Dole was elected or Clinton. It matters whether Gore was elected or Bush. But that's not nearly as big as the issues that we're debating in this current climate, okay? And I want to say that over the past 100 years, there have been four debates. And the first is, and I think the first three are connected. The first is what I'm saying is progressivism that began under Teddy Roosevelt in the period about 1900 to 1916. The problem at the time was that there were, how many people are American history, have taken some American history courses in college level? Okay, so a bunch of you have. So you know that the big problem 100 years ago when this university, shortly after this university was founded, was the city was rapidly becoming this big manufacturing enterprise, huge numbers of people coming in from Poland, from Italy, from Russia, from all these different areas, to Ireland, of course, they had been coming for 50 years. So you have the city that's becoming a big thing. There were a number of issues that came together. One was, what about these large corporations? Shouldn't they be regulated? Wasn't there a problem of monopoly? John D. Rockefeller, whose beneficence founded this university, consolidated all the oil companies essentially into one big trust. The same was true in sugar, the same was true in tobacco, and so forth. Shouldn't these trusts, which were of course extracting monopoly prices, shouldn't something be done to break them up? What about the meat packing plants on the south side? Who was going to ensure that when you and I went down to buy a hamburger that it wasn't spoiled meat or, you know, that it had been treated in sanitary conditions? What about the local government, which seemed to be sort of run like Tammany Hall with a lot of patronage and a lot of corruption? So there were a number of those issues. And out of them came the progressive movement to regulate corporations, to make local governments more honest, sometimes called the goo-goo movement, the good government movement, which still exists and tilts against the wind in Chicago. To expand democratic participation to include women and immigrants, to expand primary education so that all these people would have not only a sense that they could read things so they knew how to vote, but so that they could work in factories and so they could become Americans. So they would be taught English, and so forth. Okay, the second, of course, was the New Deal. And the New Deal comes in response to the Great Depression. And what I would say is that we miss, you know about the New Deal. What I'm going to say, however, is that we tend to overlook one important part of the New Deal, which I think will prove very important. And that's what happened in the late 1930s. In 1937, we all know that basically what happened, when Franklin Roosevelt ran on a balanced budget and opposed Keynesianism. They didn't know it was called Keynesianism at the time, but I mean, he wanted to balance the budget, he didn't. But what he did once he got in office was he tried essentially, he threw everything at the wall that he could, and whatever stuck, he tried to stick with. The problem with that was that, there were two problems. One was that when you throw a lot of things, when you change policies as rapidly as that, and as frequently as that, it creates a lot of uncertainty. So you are a business person, you're thinking, I might expand my factory, I might not, but when you see the policies this way, that way, you know, will I have to, you know, today the problem is, will I have to buy health care? Will I be subject to new environmental regulation? You know, I need to have a certain environment so I can go ahead and figure out whether it's likely to make money or not. under the economic environment was uncertain. As soon as the political environment that Roosevelt was leading became uncertain, that created additional problems, even though he was clearly trying to solve those problems. But the second issue was that some of his biggest initiatives were ruled unconstitutional by a court, by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court at the time had a kind of traditional view of the role of the Constitution, and they ruled that a number of things that the president did were unconstitutional. What Roosevelt did in response to that was, it turns out that the Constitution says nowhere how many people should be on the Supreme Court. We just think it's 9. But there's not a number in the Constitution. And Roosevelt said, okay, what I'm going to do, if you don't change your rulings, is I'm going to appoint more people to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to appoint them until I get a majority that will rule my way. If that's 15, that'll be fine. And we generally learned, at least when I was in school, that he was defeated in that because it stayed at 9. But in fact, that's a misreading. What actually happened was that the Supreme Court caved into him. That's why it didn't change. They said, you don't have to do that, we'll go your way. And after 1937, all the things that were his big initiatives that would have been ruled unconstitutional earlier were now ruled constitutional. That's going to be important because this issue of health care, for example, comes back on that. Now, I want to tell you in particular that one of the big issues is something called the Commerce Clause. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I want to make sure you understand this point about the Commerce Clause. The U.S. Constitution says that Congress and the federal government have the power to regulate interstate commerce. Why is that? Well, because when the Articles of Confederation were being considered, one of the problems is that people began to consider Virginia its own state and Pennsylvania its own state, and just like Canada can set its own tariffs and so forth against the U.S., there was a real possibility that Pennsylvania could set a tariff on things from Virginia and vice versa. Well, we didn't want that. We wanted one national tariff, and we wanted to make sure that in a state like Illinois, for example, it couldn't have a ruling that the size of rail tracks would be different from the size of rail tracks in Indiana. We can have one size through the country. We can regulate interstate commerce, and you can't put a tariff on anything coming into Illinois from Indiana, right? The question is, since almost everything you're wearing has crossed a state line, okay? And everything you're eating has crossed a state line. The air you're breathing has crossed a state line. If you expansively interpret that idea, then you're at the point where there's no limit on what the federal government could regulate. And the big issue that actually came up during this period was a farmer who was growing some food in his own backyard. And he grew the food in his own backyard, and he ate the food that he grew in his backyard. This is not a hypothetical case, you know, we have a little backyard garden. My wife grows some things, and I eat them. That's the division of labor in our house. And very effective. And the government brought a suit against him that was interstate commerce. He says, how the heck can that be interstate commerce? I'm growing it in my backyard and I'm eating it. It's not, you know, it's in Kansas the whole time. And the answer that the federal government that brought the lawsuit said, no, because you're not selling it in the interstate market when you grow, you're affecting the supply curve. And because you're not buying it in the interstate market, you're affecting the demand curve across the country. And as a result, it's interstate because it affects the whole nation's demand and supply curve, just as your breathing and breathing out CO2 affects the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and therefore might be subject to regulation by the Environmental Protection Agency under that theory. But in fact, the Supreme Court found that was that was acceptable in the aftermath of this court packing threat. They would not have found it acceptable 4 or 5 years earlier. Now they said that's fine. This comes up again in the healthcare debate, because then the question is, does the same kind of rule apply to healthcare? And the people who brought that suit on the healthcare have decided not to take on at this stage what I think you and I would consider kind of a silly and overwrought interpretation of interstate commerce to include this farmer. And they said, look, we're going to say, not rather than take that straight on, what we're going to say is that that at least involved an affirmative activity. He was growing some food and he was consuming some food. And healthcare, the healthcare law, Obamacare, involves you're not doing anything. And that would be a new, what's called a case of first impression, something entirely new. But you're not doing anything, you're not going down to get a driver's license, you're not doing anything affirmatively, you're just waking up in the morning. And then the question is, can the government, because you wake up in the morning, say you have to buy health insurance, and that meets an interstate commerce clause. So just coming back to that, I want you to understand that when we're talking about the New Deal, we're talking about a big deal. And the third great debate was in the mid-1960s, when I was a little younger than you, and that was Lyndon Johnson, race and the Great Society. And there the issue was that across the American South, African